So today I'm talking about the beautiful crisis that is Colette's middle-aged writing. Now, Colette is a tricky subject, and this is going to be a tricky video for me. I've already started and stopped this beginning so many times because there's so much to say, and Colette is so important to me as a writer that my brain is just firing really fast and my mouth can't keep up. So going to try to start this yet again slowly. Colette is known by one name. That is her maiden last name. Her full name is Sidonie Gabrielle Colette. Today I'm talking about two of her books that I find the most meaningful these days, My Mother's House and Break of Day. Now, these books are difficult to classify genre-wise. Colette wrote so many different things that cross the boundaries of a genre that they're difficult to label. Colette is a lot like Proust. They both wrote French novels, or really their lives purporting to be novels, before French literature was solidified, dare I even say calcified, into rhetorical acrobatics, dense philosophy, and fashionable despair. Colette's work, like Proust's, was sensuous and alive. It was concerned with moments in time and fascinated by life itself and its myriad beauties and pleasures. It Her writing was both inward gazing and outward experiencing. Colette was born in 1873 in a small village in the state of Burgundy. She was a country girl, and she was born to the Colette family. Like I mentioned, it was her last name. Her full name is Sidonie Gabrielle Colette. She was named after her mother, who was familiarly known as Sido. Sido was a very eccentric woman who enjoyed being a contrarian. She loved arguing points of theology with the local curate. She loved bringing her dog to church, though it was expressly forbidden. She took in pregnant servant girls, even though that was a scandalous thing to do. She was married twice. She began seeing Colette's father before she had disposed of the first one. To be a divorced woman in the late 19th century in a small town in France, that must have been tricky, and especially in a Catholic community. So she was probably a bit of an outcast, but she did not care. And so Colette grew up in an environment where her mother really ran the place. And the two of them had, I would say, a very classic mother-daughter relationship in that Colette wanted very much to get away from her mother, but was so intertwined with her mother and in their relationship that she couldn't, sever that completely. And she was, I would say, haunted by her mother, both in life and in death. Two books I'll be discussing today have to do with several big themes: childhood, sensuality, the mother-daughter dynamic, and the female midlife crisis. So when Colette was still a teenager, she married a much older man. He was about 34 to her, I believe, 18. He was the son of a friend of her parents. He was known as Willie. He was a hack writer, so he published a lot of trashy novels and then also had sort of a novel factory where other writers would work ghost writing stuff with his name on it. Um, and Colette was, in her own sort of description, a simple country girl longing to be corrupted by a man. And so they were married and they moved to Paris, and that's where she got a crash course in the decadent degeneracy of turn of the century Paris life. Um, in an act of defiance against her mother, she cut off all of her beautiful hair. She had extremely long hair that her mother was very possessive of, and they would often get up really early in the morning, so her mother would put her hair into these long braids. So one of the first things she did was bob her hair. In 1900, a novel called Claudine at School was The Toast of Paris. It was published by Willie, except he didn't write it. Colette did. He put his name on it, and he may have made some editorial suggestions and done some emendations and things like this. But for her first 4 novels, which were all these books about this character, Claudine, they were not published under her own name. And her husband took all the credit for it and got all the money. It was a huge success, became a stage play. The Claudine novels, they're not my favorite thing that Colette has written. They were her first efforts at fiction. But the first one, Claudine at School, is heavily autobiographical. It is about a young French schoolgirl growing up in a small country village who is rather amoral and longing for experience. And it's a very sexy book. Because you're also dealing with a French, schoolgirl, there's another ick factor here too. So Willie, who had a lot of extramarital dalliances pretty openly, Colette had to be okay with that because this is fin de siècle Paris. This is what's happening. He held all the power in the relationship. He had Colette and one of his mistresses, who I believe was an actress in the stage play version of Claudine, dress up like Claudine the schoolgirl and look like twins, and he would have himself photographed with the two of them. It's just, eh. So Colette went along with not only not having her writing be credited as hers, but also went along with a lot of the sexual games and menage a trois that her husband wanted to have. Colette is often seen as this daring, liberated, bisexual woman. A little more complicated than that, though, which I will discuss a little bit later in this video as well. So eventually, Colette finally has had enough of Willie, divorces him. There's a court case to determine who is the author of these Claudine books that have made Willie so famous, and she eventually wins, and her name is now restored on the books themselves. For her divorce, she continued to shock society by going on the stage, scandalized the haute monde of Paris by not only taking to the stage, which is something, a proper woman wouldn't have done, and made her own living, again, not something typical, but also because she kissed another woman on stage, her girlfriend at the time, an aristocratic French woman known as Missy, and she also went topless a couple times. So out of that experience came a novel called The Vagabond, which I actually do really like, based on her music hall experiences and her choosing a life as a writer and a performer rather than the respectable marriage. Meanwhile, back in Burgundy, her mother was not at all happy at these things going on, although her mother also sort of applauded the independence of it all and didn't really even seem to have a problem with Colette seeing other women. She wasn't really happy with the state of affairs, didn't really like the fact that Colette was divorcing and remarrying pot kettle, but still. This type of history would continue with Colette's own daughter. She did get remarried. She married a journalist and had her own daughter, whom she named after herself, just like her mother had named her after herself, except she named her Colette, so Colette Jr. basically. Except something happened. A month before her daughter was born, Sido died, and Colette did not attend her mother's funeral. That seems really heartbreaking, and I don't know that she could bear to face her mother's death. And this was in 1912. It took 10 years for Colette to start exorcising the ghosts of her mother's death, and also the hold that her mother had on her, and dealing with her own complex feelings about her childhood and everything like this. It took 10 years. And in fact, I think I've read several biographies of Colette and some more critical examinations of her writing. It seems like a lot of her biographers don't know how to treat certain aspects of her life or characteristics because of these contradictions. It's not just as simple as, loved and disliked her mother at the same time, loved her but wouldn't go to the funeral. But Colette, when feminism really started to come to the fore in French thought, particularly with Simone de Beauvoir um, in the 1940s, Simone de Beauvoir was actually one of the first to talk about Colette as a feminist. The only problem with that, though, is Colette hated the feminists. Feministe was a fairly new term in early 20th century France. And despite the fact that she made her own living and was successful at it, that, she divorced her husband, she went on the stage, she did all these things that were considered liberated. When asked what she thought about feminists, her response was, they deserve the whip and the harem. That is considered a problematic statement these days. Nobody wants to deal with the fact that a so called feminist hero really hated feminism as it was articulated then, and probably wouldn't like it now either. And what's interesting, and when she started writing about her childhood, she was extremely talented at being able to look through, to look at her life through the eyes and the heart of a child. Yet she was terrible to her own child. By all accounts, she was a really bad mother. Kind of ignored her own child's childhood. And despite all the heartbreak from her first husband, Willie, for all of his being so much older and having all these dalliances and things, she basically turned into him. She had numerous affairs with younger men. And another big contradiction, too, is that Colette did have relationships with other women. She's been classified as bisexual, but I don't think she ever thought of herself that way. It was just something she did. Because I think Colette inherited a lot of her mother's contrariness. She also enjoyed tweaking the noses of society and did a lot of things in pursuit of her own pleasure and everyone else be damned. So it was, I think, to her absolutely labelless. But as this very sexually liberated character, here's where the contradiction lies. When her own daughter came out as a lesbian, Colette was enraged. She did not want that to happen and this is because not only was Colette having affairs with other women to be that sort of liberated, sensual character she wanted to be, but also because she believed that relationships between women like this were compensatory and consolatory. If there isn't a man around, this is what you do. So again, what do biographers do with something like that when that's clearly not something that we would accept currently? But again, this is based on how she felt and her own experiences. So we still have to take it into consideration when looking at her life and her work. But the problem is every person is like this. Every person is contradictory. Every person has nuances to their character. It shouldn't stop us from reading or appreciating books. I hope it doesn't. Colette was very earthy, and sometimes that earthiness led her astray. Sometimes it did a lot. But she said, her primary aim was to just live her life. Her life was essentially her art. She fell into writing almost accidentally. And she talked about, how do you even choose these moments that get put down on paper? She didn't feel like she had a knack for it, but she definitely did. That she had to make her writing exude a few images and sort of wrap them into a bouquet. That's sort of the image she used. She also described it as, I think, beads on a necklace. I think one of the more astute scholars of Colette's work, Julia Kristeva, has talked a great deal about the confusion of Colette's life and work. The two are really inseparable. And that's why it's also difficult to pin her down on a genre for these books in particular. She wrote a lot of different things in addition to, there's so much writing. Autobiographical novels that sort of defy that genre classification. There are plays, there's journalism, film criticism, film scripts, dialogues between animals. She had a big heart for animals. Many short stories, straight up autobiographies and memoirs. Also a nonfiction work about sexuality called The Pure and the Impure. It's a prodigious output. I have not read even a fraction of all this stuff. And what makes it a little more difficult also is that a great deal of it has not been translated into English, and I do not read French fluently. So that's a thing. And you can really see if you start reading her fiction sort of from the beginning, the Claudine novels, there were four of them. Then onto The Vagabond, and then also one of her more famous novels, Cherie, which is about a 50-year-old woman who's having an affair with a much younger man. There you could see a marked shift in the way that fiction is written, and then between her more genreless fictional writing, My Mother's House and Break of Day. They are not plot driven, they're episodic and atmospheric, and propelled really by anything other than simply her life and her reminiscences of her life in the past. So they're very, very different books. And I first read all of these books, Cherie, The Vagabond, My Mother's House and its sequel, and Break of Day, all of these books. I first read them when I was 20. It's a vastly different experience reading them now. I'm 35. In the 15 years since, it's a vastly different experience. When I first read these books, I was just totally enraptured with the beauty of the writing and the way that she was able to convey her life. The beauty is really there, the desire to find beauty in life, but in the two that I'm going to be talking about specifically today, a real sense of having to create life anew and being a different person altogether from who you once were. There's a sense of time that's vastly different. I think you do experience time differently from when you were 20 to when you were 35, and maybe even when you're older. And that to me actually is the sign of a good book. If I can read it at different stages in my life and find something fresh in those different ages, that's a keeper. But I also at 20 didn't really pick up on the melancholy that's underlying a lot of this beauty, especially the rediscovery of her mother at a really difficult period in her own life during her sort of midlife crisis. That sorrow, that melancholy is really needed there for contrast, because I mean, we often say, what makes something beautiful? Why do we look at a flower and go, oh, that's amazingly beautiful? It's because of its evanescence. It's because we know it's something that will end. So in order for something to be beautiful, there also needs to be perhaps something terrifying. It's a very, very romanticist notion, I suppose. So that melancholy is needed for contrast, and it also presents a more holistic and realistic understanding of life. So that was all kind of a lengthy context for the mere two books that I'm going to be talking about, but because her life is so intertwined with the work, we do have to know some things about her life, I think, to really get at these two books. So My Mother's House. So published in 1922, 10 years after her mother died. These are very much episodes of life in the small village in Burgundy, remembering her mother. And not just her mother, but also the rest of the family. Her dad is in here, her siblings. She had a very eccentric family altogether. Her older sister, whom she calls her sister with the long hair, would stay in bed pretty much all day reading novels. And one of her brothers had a thing for cemeteries. He would create little cardboard headstones and put them in the yard and conduct imaginary funerals. And Sido went nuts over this and would always try to clear them because she thought it was weird and morbid. Maybe that's true, but Sido passed along to her daughter a great love of nature, and she cared so much for animals and even insects that she wouldn't kill even a spider who lived in her room. There was a spider who would descend from the ceiling of her bedroom every evening to take a little sip out of Sido's hot chocolate, and then he'd retreat back up onto the ceiling, and her mother was like, oh yeah, that's my friend the spider. Crazy. I would never do that. I don't kill them. I put them back outside. But no, I'm not sharing my chocolate with them. So in My Mother's House, Colette really manages to propel herself back into her childhood and sort of approach things with that sense of unself-conscious wonder that a lot of children have, to the point where, you know, you hear a word that you think is really beautiful, but you have no idea what the meaning of it is, and you just kind of keep it, to yourself. And when you find out the meaning of it, it has nothing to do with how you imagined it, you're disappointed. And there is sort of that sense of becoming aware of the world in sort of that raw, sensuous way of, seeing animals in their natural habitat doing their soul circle of life business, and seeing, women be married off in these sort of peasant weddings that she liked to go to. And there's a curious episode in the middle of the book as well about this girl who lived in the village who was considered a beauty and was almost haughty in a way, like a Madame Bovary type was haughty, waiting for an appropriate suitor for her, to carry her off somewhere. And year after year after year, she would still be like this, waiting for someone because nobody was good enough for her. Until finally, Colette comes back to the village years later and sees this bitter looking woman coming down the street and realize, that's that little Baloo girl, the one who was so beautiful. So that sense of evanescence that I mentioned earlier, why are things beautiful? Because they will stop being beautiful, is very much there. Sort of strewn throughout the book. I think even to the point where the eccentric brother and his interest in cemeteries, he finds something beautiful about death and something peaceful about the finality of it. And there's just a whole sense too of just mystery throughout the book, in terms of, what happens, when she's 13 and she goes to a wedding and they see the wedding bed being prepared, like, oh, just that sort of sense of there's a whole adult and sort of animal world out there that a child doesn't really have access to. You can see it and not understand it. But of course, this is being written by a nearly 50-year-old woman, so there's a whole weighted world of experience here that she's, and then projecting back into her childhood, trying to maybe leave the experiences behind, but you know that they're there. And one of my favorite things, though, as I mentioned earlier, is Sido's battle with the curate. And here's a passage from that. She, Sido, threw round her shoulders her best black cashmere, jet-beaded pelisse, put on her little bonnet trimmed with bunches of purple lilac, and with her inimitable sprightly gait, toes turned out, heels barely touching the ground, step round she did to ring the bell at Monsieur le Curé's door, 100 yards away. I could hear from our house its sad crystalline tinkle, and I sat uncomfortably visualizing a dramatic encounter with threats and abuse between my mother and the parish priest. My romantic child's heart thumped painfully at the bang of the closing front door, but my mother reappeared wreathed in smiles, and my father, lowering le temps before his face, bushy as a forest landscape, inquired, "Well?" "Very well indeed," was my mother's quick rejoinder. "I've got him." "The curé?" "No, of course not. The pelargonium cutting he was guarding so jealously. The one that has 2 deep purple petals and 3 pink ones. Here he is. I'm going to pot him at once. He's also promised me his Spanish honeysuckle, the one that has leaves variegated with white that we can smell from here when there's a westerly wind." So she essentially, is in a battle with the priest, not only over, her soul, but over some precious garden cuttings. The aged curé, almost subjugated by my mother's voice, her imperious kindness, and her scandalous sincerity, ventured nonetheless to suggest that Mass was not to be said for dogs. She bristled like a belligerent hen. "My dog? Turn my dog out of church? What, are you afraid he may learn there?" It isn't a question of my dog, who is a model of deportment, a dog that gets up and lies down in unison with your congregation. "All that is true enough, my dear lady, but you can't deny that last Sunday he growled during the elevation." "But of course he growled during the elevation. I should be very much surprised if he didn't growl during the elevation. Haven't I trained him myself to be a watchdog and to bark whenever he hears a bell?" The great battle of the dog in church, punctuated by truces and acute crises, lasted a long time, but the final victory remained with my mother. At 11 o'clock, with her dog in attendance, a very well behaved dog, it must be added, she would shut herself into the family pew just underneath the pulpit with that slightly forced and childish gaiety which she was wont to assume as a Sunday garment. The holy water, the sign of the cross, she forgot nothing, not even the appropriate genuflections. Oh, yeah, what a stubborn mother. Wow. So, in addition to these reminiscences of her childhood, Colette the adult also appears a few times in talking about visiting her mother's house from Paris. In this little chapter titled My Mother and the Forbidden Fruit, she says, "The time came when all her strength left her. She was amazed beyond measure and would not believe it. Whenever I arrived from Paris to see her, as soon as we were alone in the afternoon in her little house, she had always some sin to confess to me. On one occasion, she turned up the hem of her dress, rolled her stocking down over her shin, and displayed a purple bruise, the skin nearly broken. 'Just look at that.' 'What on earth have you done to yourself this time, mother?' She opened wide eyes, full of innocence and embarrassment. 'You wouldn't believe it, but I fell downstairs.' 'How do you mean, fell?' 'Just what I said. I fell for no reason. I was going downstairs and I fell. I can't understand it.' 'Were you going down too quickly?' 'Too quickly? What do you call too quickly? I was going down quickly. Have I time to go downstairs majestically like the Sun King? After that I left the cupboard alone.' She broke off, blushing furiously. 'What cupboard?' I demanded severely. My mother fenced, tossing her head as though I were trying to put her on a lead. 'Oh, nothing, no cupboard at all.' 'Mother, I shall get cross.' The cupboard was a massive object of old walnut, almost as broad as it was high, with no carving save the circular hole made by a Prussian bullet that had entered by the right-hand door and passed out through the back panel. 'Do you want it moved from the landing, mother?' An expression like that of a young she-cat, false and glittery, appeared on her wrinkled face. 'I? No, it seems to me all right there. Let it stay where it is.' So basically, she was doing all the things we tell our old parents not to do. Stop moving heavy furniture. Don't climb on the roof. You know, don't do all the stuff that you used to do, basically. And that was the forbidden fruit, is ignoring her advanced age and continuing to do these heavily physical things that she always did. Um, oh man, that's relatable. So it's My Mother's House is maybe more lighthearted than the second book I'm going to talk about, Break of Day, because of the humor, especially concerning her mother. And there isn't a whole lot to do in that particular volume with her mother's death, although that was ever present in Colette's mind. So the second book is Break of Day, which was published in 1928. Colette wrote this book. She was over 50 by that point, and it's about the aftermath of the breakup of her second marriage. When she divorced her second husband, she was at loose ends. She bought a house on her own in Saint Tropez, so on the coast, and basically decided to retreat from city life and go back to what she thought would be a simpler life. And I think it's very interesting that both of these books have to do with a house and retreating to that place. In the first instance, my mother's house, it's solely in her memory. But in this volume, it is literal. She's going to a separate place to think about her life and particularly try to understand the situation with love, because she's had two failed marriages and a bunch of other relationships, and she's now over 50 years old, and she's asking the question, is this going to be my last house? Was that going to be my last relationship? And she does believe at that point in her life that she's done with men. She says at one point, this is I haven't been by myself since I was 16. I've always been involved with someone, and she's basically learning how to be by herself, with herself, and coming into her own at an advanced age. And not only this, but that she wants a respite and a rest from the grind of relationships, that everything up till now has been about power. Yeah, she says, so if I were to enter the lists again, that future, this future that she's carved out for herself now, would be entirely given over to burning truths, to bitternesses more cruel than all, or else to duels where each side wants to outstrip the other in pride. And so a few things are going on in this book, one of which is a major rebuttal to those who would say you need a man, and you shouldn't be on your own. There's a very long piece of dialogue in the book between her and a younger male friend who's into her. And he's a lot younger. I think he's about 15 years her junior. And she wants him to go off with someone in his own age, a neighbor friend there. And she wants to keep her solitude, ultimately. And this is where she says, "This is the first time since I was 16 that I'm going to have to live or even die without my life or death depending on love. It's so extraordinary. You can't know. You have time," she tells the young man. So Colette, by that point in her life, was known as a sort of philosophe of love and sexuality. So for her to basically renounce all this stuff was a complete turnaround to what she was known for, and a badly needed retreat from everything she thought she knew about herself and how the public perceived her. And it's a very different bit of writing, this and My Mother's House, from her previous work. And because it's so rich in her observations and what's going on inside of her, I think they're actually much better books. These are her mature works. She's matured as a writer, and she's matured as a person. Took a while, but she did it. The entire book is interspersed with excerpts from letters that her mother wrote to her. And when you re-examine the book, you know, away from this idea, of the simple life and even just sort of the surface beauty of it, her mother is all over this book. So this is the work of the mature writer, a mature person who's no longer pursuing pleasure for its own sake, who denies herself certain pleasures for self-improvement. And interestingly, the love that she seeks now is not from a man. It's the love from her mother that she no longer has real access to except via her memory. The rediscovery of her mother, and now this more identification with her mother, a more sympathetic understanding of her, brings Colette back to herself. Because the only real love that she's had is the love from her mother. It was pure. It wasn't, this was not a sexual love. This was not a romantic love. This was not a battle for supremacy, at least, other than I'm your mother and I know better. It was not that kind of soul destroying battle for supremacy. It was more, I'm telling you this because I love you type thing. Colette is beginning to understand. She wanted to, escape her mother when she was younger, and realizes she shouldn't have been escaping from her. And the book opens, in fact, with one of Sido's letters. It was actually a letter that Sido wrote to Colette's husband at the time, saying, "Oh, thank you for the invitation to come spend some time with you two. But as much as I love my daughter, and I do adore her, I can't leave my home right now." She says, "The reason is that my pink cactus is probably going to flower. It's a very rare plant I've been given, and I'm told that in our climate it flowers only once every 4 years. Now I am already a very old woman, and if I went away when my pink cactus is about to flower, I am certain I shouldn't see it flower again." Gotta love that, plant and flower love that Sido had. But at the same time, Colette's choosing to open with this letter is rather symbolic, I think, because this is also about patiently waiting for something to bloom, in this case herself, and the fact that her mother would have that patience to wait around for um, something rare and precious that she's cultivating, that's very much like the mother-daughter relationship. And the whole title of the book, Break of Day, of course, is about starting over, having a new day. And she ties in this theme of dawn and this blooming of the plants and that type of thing, again with the memories of her mother and the love that she feels for her mother. My favorite passage, actually, this is her writing about her mother, and I'm going to quote it somewhat at length because I think it's actually central to the book. So she's talking here about how her mother would keep getting up earlier and earlier every day to be alone, um, with her plants and with the birds and things without anybody else around. So she wanted the jungle to be virgin, but even so inhabited only by swallows, cats, and bees, and the huge spider balancing atop his wheel of lace, silvered by the night. The neighbor's shutter banging against the wall spoiled her dream of being an unchangeable explorer, a dream repeated every day at the hour when the cold dew seems to be falling, with little irregular plops from the beaks of the blackbirds. She got up at 6, then at 5, and at the end of her life a little red lamp awakened her in winter, long before the Angelus smote the black air. In those moments while it was still night, my mother used to sing, falling silent as soon as anyone was able to hear. My mother climbed, too, mounting ceaselessly up the ladder of the hours, trying to possess the beginning of the beginning. I know what that particular intoxication is like, but what she sought was a red horizontal ray and the pale sulfur that comes from the red ray. She wanted the damp wing that the first bee stretches out like an arm. The summer wind that springs up at the approach of the sun gave her its first fruits in scents of acacia and wood smoke. When a horse pawed the ground and whinnied softly in the neighboring stable, she was the first to hear it. On an autumn morning she was the only one to see herself reflected in the first disk of ephemeral ice in the well bucket before her nail cracked it. How I wish I could have put before that hard and convex nail made for cutting stalks, plucking scented leaves, scraping off green fly, and questioning seeds sleeping in the earth. How I wish I could have put it before my own mirror of long ago. That tender face, so little virile, that gave me back my own image beautified. I would have said to my mother, "Look, see what I'm doing, measure what it's worth. It is worth my assuming a tarnished reputation in order to nourish in secret, mouth to mouth. Is it worth my turning away from those dawns that you and I love to give myself to eyelids that I dazzle and their promises of stardom? Judge better than I can my hesitant work that I've gazed at too much. Trim your hard gardener's nail." But it was too late. By the time I confessed all that to her, she had already attained her everlasting morning twilight. She would, alas, have judged us plainly, with that divine cruelty of hers which was innocent of wrath. "Pluck off that rather unnatural shoot of yours, my daughter, that graft that doesn't want to thrive except on you. It's a mistletoe. I assure you it's a mistletoe. I'm not saying to you that it's a bad thing to take on a mistletoe, because evil and good can be equally resplendent and fruitful, but when I try to invent what she would have said to me, there is always one place at which I falter. I lack the words, above all the essential argument, the unexpected and equally enchanting blame and indulgence which fell from her so lightly, slow to touch and gently penetrate my clay, and then come to the surface again. Now they well up in what I write, and sometimes they are thought beautiful. So she's learned a great deal from her mother, even posthumously. This this relationship that perhaps she took for granted previously. But in that passage about describing her mother alone, that maybe is the ideal she's striving for. This is someone who didn't have eyes on her. She was living her life outside of the anyone else's influence. She was getting up earlier and earlier to be by herself. Even at an advanced age, she knew who she was, and she knew what she wanted to do every day. In a way, I think Colette mythologizes her mother a little bit through both of these volumes, but I think that's fairly normal when you've lost someone, particularly someone who actually mattered to you a great deal. So I think, this book deals not just with this beautiful crisis that Colette is undergoing, but it's also finally dealing with the grief of her mother's death. At one point in the book, she does also say, "I'm not interested in death, even my own." And at that point, she wasn't really thinking about her own mortality. That would come in later books when she was much older and a lot in pretty bad shape health wise. Um, but, even with everything, even with the melancholic undertone and the contrast needed, this is still a very, very, I am interested in life book, and I am interested in life because my dead mother was interested in life, and these are the things she passed on to me. So, in that sense, I don't think it's really a denial of mortality or what's coming. An affirmation of the beauty and the preciousness of life. And Colette was not done. She ended up, well, of course, at this point she wouldn't know this, but she did end up being married again, a more lasting relationship. It was with a man somewhat younger, 15 years, I believe, her junior, who was with her until she died, and who was with her during the occupation, um, and the deprivations of war, and who was arrested by the Gestapo at one point. I mean, there were some hard times. Who was with her when she was bound in a wheelchair because her arthritis was so bad when she was older. So she did have more, it turns out, to give love wise. Um, but these two books, My Mother's House and Break of Day, I think mark a huge turning point in Colette's writing and her life, which of course she thought were one and the same.